Okay, let's go. Number 1. Roswell Army Airfield. The year is 1947. You're the base flight surgeon at Roswell Army Airfield, the most security-sensitive installation in the United States. The 509th Bomb Group is the only atomic-capable air unit in existence. You know every aircraft in inventory, every piece of equipment cleared for this base, every metal alloy that appears on military hardware. On the morning of July 8th, a call reaches your office about a debris field 68 miles north of town on Mac Brazel's ranch, and within the hour you're standing in a field looking at material that doesn't belong to any of those categories. The debris is scattered across an area roughly 3/4 of a mile long. The material is lighter than it should be for its apparent structural strength. When you fold it, it returns to its original shape without a crease or compression mark. There are small I-beams in the wreckage, with symbols along their inner surfaces that correspond to no designation system you've encountered in military service. By afternoon, military trucks are removing everything. By evening, Base Commander Colonel William Blanchard has issued a press release stating the Army has recovered a flying disc. 12 hours later, General Roger Ramey in Fort Worth announces it was a weather balloon. Blanchard's press release was not a mistake made by a confused officer. He was meticulous, career forward, on the command track that would eventually take him to Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force. He issued that statement because of what his personnel had described to him. Ramey's correction came from above Blanchard's level. That is always the direction those corrections come from. Here's where it gets strange. The 1994 congressional investigation, mandated by Congress, producing a 1,000-page report, concluded the debris was from Project Mogul, a classified balloon program designed to monitor Soviet nuclear testing. That explanation accounts for the debris field. It does not account for the mortuary office. Roswell Base mortuary records from the week of July 8, 1947, obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, document a request from the base physician for 5 child-sized hermetically sealed caskets. The request is specific about dimensions. It is specific about the hermetic seal. The base physician who filed it transferred out of Roswell within 90 days, with no documented reason for the reassignment anywhere in his personnel file. He died in 1959. His family has stated that he refused to discuss that summer for the remainder of his life, and that they understood not to ask. Project Mogul balloons do not produce casualties. The transfer request for non-standard caskets implies biological material was recovered at the debris site or at a secondary location the congressional investigation does not mention. The 1994 report addressed the physical debris. It does not address the mortuary request. It does not explain why a hermetically sealed child-sized casket was required. It does not explain why the physician who ordered it was transferred. 1,600 pages of Roswell documentation were released under FOIA across the 1990s and into the 2000s. Within that release, the period from July 5th through July 14th, 1947, the 10 days covering the entire recovery operation, contains no standard unit logs, no base activity reports, no routine administrative documentation of any kind. 10 days of operational records from the most security-sensitive air installation in the United States are simply not there. Not redacted, not exempted, absent. The Army closed the case in 1994. The case they described doesn't account for what the documents they released actually show. The next case produced a different kind of absence, a government agency that acknowledged receiving an object and then acknowledged losing the record of what it was. Number 2. Kecksburg Acorn Site. The year is 1965. You're a volunteer firefighter in Kecksburg, a township in Westmoreland County, and the radio has been active since dusk. Something crossed the sky over Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania in a low, sustained arc that witnesses across 3 states described as controlled. Meteors do not change trajectory. What residents tracked over the course of its approach was an object adjusting its angle of descent as it came down, moving with a deliberateness that ballistic debris doesn't have. By the time it entered Westmoreland County airspace, it was moving slowly enough for people to follow it from their yards. Then, the tree line absorbed it. You drive toward the impact area east of town and get approximately 200 yards into the trees before military personnel already on the ground turn you back. Not local police, military. They arrived at a rural Pennsylvania crash site before the volunteer fire department did. By the time your chief and his crew are formally redirected away from the perimeter, a flatbed truck is already moving through the tree line toward the field. What Fire Department Chief Robert Bittner and his crew observed in the brief window before they were stopped. An object the size of a Volkswagen Beetle embedded in the earth at a shallow angle, acorn-shaped, with a raised band running around its lower circumference that carried symbols in a style several witnesses independently described as resembling Egyptian hieroglyphs. Not serial numbers, not manufacturer identification marks, symbols. The object had no visible seams, no external hardware, no propulsion mechanism. The official explanation issued within hours. Cosmos 96, a Soviet satellite. That identification was subsequently disproven by NASA's own orbital debris tracking records. Cosmos 96 re-entered the atmosphere over Canada approximately 13 hours before the Kecksburg event. The Air Force had tracked Cosmos 96's descent separately, and the data was documented. The object that came down in Kecksburg that evening was not any satellite in the publicly tracked inventory for that date. Here's where it gets strange. Journalist Leslie Kean spent years in the 1990s filing FOIA requests, specifically targeting what the military had done with the object removed from the Kecksburg site. Her requests established that the object had been transported under military escort to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. More significantly, her request produced a statement from NASA in 2009 acknowledging that documents related to an object received from the Kecksburg recovery operation could not be located. NASA confirmed receiving the object. NASA acknowledged losing the paperwork. A metallurgical consultant brought in to examine the recovered material was, according to multiple individuals interviewed by researcher Stan Gordon through the 1980s, a civilian contractor operating under AEC clearances. His name has not been confirmed publicly. What is confirmed is that he submitted a preliminary analysis and did not submit a closeout report, the standard project completion document required at the end of any contracted examination. He departed the arrangement without filing it. His clearances were subsequently suspended, not lapsed. Suspension is a specific administrative outcome. Clearances are renewed or allowed to expire when contractors leave projects normally. They are suspended when something specific has occurred that prevents normal processing. The suspension record exists in the accessible portion of his administrative file. The reason for the suspension does not. Whatever came down over Kecksburg in 1965 was tracked across 3 states, recovered under military control, and transported to an Air Force base. The official explanation was wrong by the government's own records. NASA acknowledged the object and acknowledged losing the documentation. The consultant left without his closeout report. His clearances were suspended. The case was officially closed. The object moved. Number 3. Height 611 Impact Site. The year is 1986. You're a geologist with the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and your assignment brief is 4 words. Anomalous Impact Event. Dalnogorsk. Dalnogorsk is an industrial city in Primorsky Krai, in far eastern Russia, close enough to the Pacific coast that on clear days you can see the water from higher ground. The air here is cold and clean and carries the smell of pine resin from the surrounding ranges. Nothing about the environment of this posting suggests you are about to spend 2 years working through results that a review board will eventually refuse to publish. On the night of January 29th, dozens of Dalnogorsk residents watched an object approximately the size of a large automobile move through the valley below Hill 611 at roughly 200 feet of altitude. The path was parallel to the ground. The object produced no sound, not reduced sound, no sound at any point in its traversal of the valley. It then impacted the summit. The impact produced no explosion. Witnesses at the base of the hill described a red glow at the summit that persisted for approximately an hour. The impact site on the summit covers roughly 33 feet by 6.5 feet. The rock surface shows thermal disruption, inconsistent with any known impact category. Not a chemical fire, not an electrical discharge, not a kinetic projectile. The vegetation burn pattern doesn't match the spread characteristics of a standard ground fire. You collect substrate samples. The laboratory analysis comes back and stops your review board cold. Here's where it gets strange. The soil and rock matrix at the site contains a mesh of glass-like threads, approximately 17 microns in diameter, with a metallic coating. The formation temperature required to produce this material, fused into the substrate at that depth and density, exceeds what the impact event itself could have generated. The laboratory cannot account for the discrepancy. More specifically, a lead fragment recovered at the site carries an isotopic ratio of lead-2O6 to lead-2O7, inconsistent with any ore deposit on the geologic record in the Soviet system at the time. Isotopic ratios in heavy metals are provenance signatures. They are how geologists trace where a mineral came from, because specific deposits produce specific ratios with the consistency of a fingerprint. The lead from height 611 matches no known deposit. The Soviet Academy of Sciences' own formal conclusion describes its provenance as unknown. You file your findings. The report is classified. Partial sections are declassified after 1991, but the materials analysis, the glass thread formation data, the isotopic results, the provenance conclusion on the lead remains restricted. The lead fragments are transferred to a facility whose name you are not permitted to record in your documentation. Within 12 months, you are reassigned to a routine mineral survey in western Siberia. 3 colleagues who had independently begun follow-up examination of the site materials are reassigned within the same period. The timing is not coincidental in a way that a Soviet scientist would mistake. When 4 researchers working the same anomalous result are each moved to unrelated postings in the same 12-month window, the message is administrative and clear. The declassified portions of the report describe the Dolnogorsk event as of uncertain nature, the most cautious phrasing available in Soviet scientific administrative language, applied to an event that produced isotopically unplaceable heavy metal and thermally inexplicable glass mesh material at a summit in Primorsky Krai. The hill is accessible, the materials analysis is not. Number 4. Shag Harbor submersible object. The year is 1967. You're a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer stationed at Barrington Passage, Nova Scotia, and 11 calls have come in over 12 minutes from residents across the Shag Harbor area, fishing families, people who have looked at this water their entire lives. All of them are describing the same thing: an object with flashing orange lights low over the water, a loud impact, a yellow light on the surface moving slowly south, and then nothing. It went under. You drive to the wharf. 5 civilian boats are already moving toward the location. A pale amber glow is still visible from shore, roughly the width of a school bus. By the time you've reached the site by water, the light is gone. On the surface where it was, there is a yellowish foam. It has a smell that is not salt, not brine, something else entirely. You file your preliminary report with the RCMP Marine Division and the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax. The Canadian military initiates a formal search. Naval vessels, including HMCS Granby, are deployed. Divers enter the water over the following 3 days. These are not disputed facts. The Department of National Defense's documents confirm the search under file designation Incident 13002, and those records were partially released through access to information requests in the 1990s. The divers find no debris consistent with a crashed aircraft, no wrecked marine vessel, nothing that explains the foam or the light. After 3 days, the search is suspended. The official conclusion, recorded in the DND file, is that the object remains unidentified, not misidentified, not under investigation, unidentified. The government document uses the word object. Canada formally documented an unidentified aerial and submersible object event, conducted a military search, recovered nothing, and filed the case without providing an alternative explanation. The unidentified designation was never changed. Here's where it gets strange. One of the divers who participated in the underwater survey described his experience to researcher Chris Stiles in 1993. He had not followed a debris field. He had followed a displacement pattern in the seafloor sediment, a disturbance consistent with slow movement rather than a static resting object. The trail led toward open water rather than terminating at any concentration of material. He filed this observation in his post-dive report through standard military channels. That report was classified within the military hierarchy. It did not appear in the Access to Information release. The diver subsequently submitted 3 separate Access to Information requests for his own post-dive report. All 3 were denied. The denial codes cited national security exemptions, not the standard privacy exemptions that govern personnel records, not the operational exemptions that cover sensitive methods or equipment. National security exemptions, the category applied when disclosure would harm Canada's defense or intelligence interests. A professional naval diver requesting access to his own observations, filed in the course of a routine search and recovery operation, was denied on national security grounds. That outcome has a specific legal meaning in Canadian administrative law. Someone determined that the contents of that report represented a threat to national security interests if released. You don't make that determination about a report that documented nothing found. The Shag Harbor incident is the only case in North American history in which a government formally classified an event under an unretracted, unidentified designation, conducted a military search, and then sealed the primary observational report from that search on national security grounds. Canada did not say the case was solved. Canada said it was unidentified and closed the evidence. The foam dissolved decades ago. The diver's report is still classified. Number 5. Varginha Biological Recovery Zone. The year is 1996. You're a military physician at the Regional Hospital of Varginha, a city of approximately 120,000 in the southern interior of Minas Gerais state, Brazil. On the morning of January 20th, military personnel bring a patient to your examination room. The room is standard examination table, overhead lighting, the neutral smell of a medical ward. What is placed on the table is not standard. You have a medical degree. You have practiced for years. What you are looking at does not belong to any organism classification your training prepared you to encounter. Civilian witnesses in the Jardim Andere neighborhood had made 2 observations in the hours before military units arrived. A figure approximately 5 feet tall, with dark brown skin, large red eyes, and 3 bony protrusions along the crown of its head, had been found crouched in a drainage ditch. Local firefighters were called. Military units arrived within minutes and relieved them. The firefighters were instructed to leave the scene. The drainage area was fenced and sealed within 24 hours. The Brazilian Army's official position for the following 8 months was that nothing had occurred. In September 1996, under sustained pressure from Brazilian UFO researchers who had compiled 19 signed civilian witness statements, including declarations from police officers and firefighters, the Army issued a statement. On January 20th, their units had recovered an injured man who was mentally disturbed. No name, no medical record. No administrative file for that individual was ever produced in any subsequent inquiry. Here's where it gets strange. Dr. Leila Cabral, a physician at the Regional Hospital of Varginha, was confirmed by multiple hospital colleagues to have been present during the examination of whatever was brought in that morning. She did not publicly confirm this. What is documented? She applied for an emergency transfer out of Varginha within 6 weeks of January 20th. The transfer was approved and processed in 11 days. Under standard Brazilian public health administrative procedures, an emergency transfer of that classification typically requires 3 to 4 months of processing time. Her transfer was expedited to 11 days. She relocated to a city 3 states away. When journalist Claudia Moraes contacted her former colleagues at the hospital in 1997, multiple staff members confirmed she had been present on the morning of the 20th. Dr. Cabral has not made a public statement on the matter in 28 years. Marco Chirace was a firefighter who made the initial contact with the figure at the drainage site. He was hospitalized in early February with a severe inflammatory condition. He died on February 15, 1996. He was 23 years old. His listed cause of death was pneumococcal meningitis. The Brazilian Army arranged and attended his funeral in full military ceremony. Standard military funeral honors in Brazil are not extended to civilians. When his family asked why military officers were present, no explanation was provided. The Army produced no documentation explaining its attendance at the ceremony. A physician transferred in 11 days. A 23-year-old dead of an inflammatory illness 5 weeks after contact. A military ceremony for a civilian with no administrative record explaining it. The Brazilian Army's only formal statement produced no name, no record, no file for the person they claimed to have recovered. In a country with mandatory documentation requirements for all military medical procedures, the events of January 20th in Varginha left no paper trail. Whatever was on that examination table, the administrative record around it was managed with a speed and completeness that the standard procedures for managing a routine psychiatric emergency would not require. Number 6. Rendlesham Forest Radiation Site. The year is 1980. You're an airman at RAF Bentwaters, a joint US-UK installation in Suffolk, and it is 3 in the morning on December 26th. A security patrol has just reported lights in Rendlesham Forest adjacent to the East Gate. Two airmen, John Burroughs and Jim Peniston, went out 20 minutes ago, and the radio traffic since has not been routine. Peniston's voice on the recording is measured, not urgent, the way trained personnel sound when they are being precise about something they know sounds improbable. By the time a second team follows them into the tree line, what they found has already started happening. Peniston and Burroughs found a craft. That is what their written statements, filed with the base the following morning, state directly. A triangular object approximately 9 feet at its widest, hovering just above the forest floor. The surface carried symbols they could not identify. Peniston placed his hand on it. He described the material as warm, not cold, the way exposed metal would be in a December forest at 3 in the morning. He sketched the symbols in his notebook that night. The notebook still exists. The symbols still correspond to no known military designation or marking system. The object rose without sound and was gone. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the deputy base commander, was on base that night. He went into the forest on the second night, December 27th, with a team and a Geiger counter. He recorded audio throughout. The tape exists. In 1984, Halt submitted a formal memorandum to the British Ministry of Defence. 2 nights of unexplained events, craft description, witness accounts, radiation measurements. That document is known as the Halt Memo. It is in the UK National Archives. It is an official United States military record. Here's where it gets strange. The radiation readings recorded at the landing site on the second night registered 25 times the normal background level for that type of temperate forest in Suffolk. Those readings, captured on Halt's tape and forwarded to the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, appear in the FOIA release with substantial redactions. A physicist contracted by the Ministry of Defense to analyze soil samples from the landing site submitted an initial report in January 1981. He submitted a revised version in March 1981. He then withdrew from the project entirely. His name does not appear in any subsequent MOD documentation on the Rendlesham case. When journalists submitted access to information requests for the physicist's later communications with the MOD, the response stated the relevant correspondence had been destroyed under the standard 25-year document disposal policy. The initial January 1981 report in the portion that was released notes that the soil sample contained trace chemical markers not consistent with any local, industrial, or agricultural chemical source. The remainder of that report is redacted. The 25-year disposal policy is real, and routine documents are regularly destroyed under it. But documents are designated for preservation when their subject matter warrants retention, and the threshold for that designation is not high. Someone specifically determined that this physicist's correspondence about the highest-profile unexplained military incident in British history was not worth keeping. That is a determination, not a default. Routine disposal is passive. This was a choice applied to a specific file. A physicist who submitted 2 reports withdrew, and whose communications were then not preserved. The administrative shape of that sequence is not what normal project closure looks like. The Halt memo is in the National Archives. The radiation is on the tape. The soil analysis is redacted. The physicist's later correspondence is gone. Number 7. Trans-en-Provence impact site. The year is 1981. You're a farmer in the village of Trans-en-Provence in the Var department of southern France, working on the lower terrace of your property, when you hear a low whistling sound coming from somewhere above and to the northeast. You look up. A lead-gray disc, roughly 8 feet in diameter, is descending toward your field. It lands on the terrace. You can see 2 circular protrusions on its underside resting against the ground. It sits there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then it rises, drawing soil and dried vegetation up beneath it as it lifts and accelerates away in the direction it came from. The whole event takes less than 30 seconds. Renato Nicolai was 67 years old when this happened to him. He reported the event the following day to the local gendarmerie, who documented it and forwarded the file. What happened next is what separates Trans-en-Provence from every other case on this list. A government agency with scientific staff and a formal mandate dispatched trained investigators, collected physical evidence, commissioned independent laboratory analysis, and published the results in an official technical document. GIPAN, the Groupe d'études des phénomènes aérospatiaux, non-identifies, operating under the French National Center for Space Studies, was France's official UFO investigation unit, staffed by engineers and scientists since 1977. When the Trans-en-Provence report arrived, Geppen investigators traveled to the site. They photographed the trace. They collected soil samples from the impact zone and surrounding areas. They measured the ring 2.5 feet wide, 8 feet in diameter. They commissioned independent laboratory analysis at 2 separate French research institutions. Here's where it gets strange. The soil at the impact point had been compressed and heated. Analysis placed the temperature between 300 and 600 degrees Fahrenheit at the contact area, concentrated in a pattern consistent with the dimensions Nicolai described. More significantly, Geppen commissioned Professor Michel Bunias of INRA France's National Agricultural Research Institute to analyze vegetation samples from the site. Bunias found that wild alfalfa plants within the trace ring showed abnormal chlorophyll content, accelerated cell aging indicators, and biochemical changes that decreased systematically with distance from the center. The plants closest to the impact point showed changes consistent with exposure to an electromagnetic field of unusual intensity. Bunias concluded in his published report that the changes could not be accounted for by any known agricultural, mechanical, or chemical process. The Geppen Technical Report on Trans-en-Provence is a public document. It describes a physical event that left material evidence, analyzed by independent government-affiliated scientists at 2 institutions, which they collectively could not explain within any known framework. The report states this directly, without speculation, noting the results and acknowledging they are not accounted for by anything in their reference models. Dr. Claude Poher, Geppen's founding director, spent years working to establish serious scientific engagement with anomalous aerial events within the French institutional framework. Trans-en-Provence was, by the standards of that framework, exactly the kind of physical evidence case the unit existed to investigate. The soil was heated to temperatures that had no source. The vegetation showed biochemical disruption that had no cause. The government's own scientists published findings they couldn't explain, and then the institutional response to those findings was to allocate no further resources toward explaining them. Poher eventually left official work entirely and established an independent research effort outside the government structure. He described the institutional reluctance to follow the evidence as the central frustration of his career. The report is available. The soil analysis is in it. The vegetation findings are in it. The French government's own scientists found results they could not account for and said so in a published document. What produced those results has never been officially identified. Number 8. Colares Island Operation Saucer Site. The year is 1977. You're a resident of Colares, a small island in the mouth of the Para River in northern Brazil, and you have spent the past several months watching something move through the sky above the forest at night that doesn't belong to any aircraft you recognize. It isn't simply lights. The craft or crafts have been descending close to the island. Residents have been approached in the dark and struck by beams of concentrated light that burn and puncture the skin. Several people have been hospitalized with injuries no one can explain through any conventional cause. The events have continued for months, affecting dozens of people, and now the Brazilian Air Force has arrived to investigate. Operação Prado, Operation Saucer, was a classified Brazilian Air Force investigation conducted between September and December of 1977. In response to the ongoing events on Colares and surrounding areas in Para State. It was commanded by Captain Urange Bolivar Soares Nogueira de Holanda Lima. Over the course of the investigation, Holanda's team collected over 500 photographs, recorded 15 hours of film footage, documented the medical cases of residents who had been injured, and compiled hundreds of pages of testimony. The investigation was not speculative. The files were real. When the operation concluded, everything was classified. Hollanda was given a direct order, deny the investigation had ever taken place. He held that silence for 20 years. Here's where it gets strange. In 1997, journalist Claude Covo tracked Hollanda down and conducted a series of recorded interviews, hours of testimony in which Hollanda described what his team had witnessed directly. He described craft that his investigators had observed at close range, moving in ways that eliminated any aerodynamic explanation he had been trained to apply. He described the medical documentation on residents who had sustained burns from the beams. He described the photographs and the footage and what they showed. He described the order to say nothing, and what maintaining that silence for 2 decades had done to him. He said he could no longer carry it. Urange Hollanda died by suicide 3 months after completing those interviews. He was 53 years old. In 2004, the Brazilian Air Force partially declassified a portion of the Operation Saucer files. Additional material was released in 2009. The releases confirmed the investigation had occurred, confirmed Holanda's command role, confirmed the scale of the photographic collection. The medical cases burn and puncture injuries on people who had never been near any conventional heat or energy source that would produce those patterns remain in the record without explanation. The 15 hours of film footage have not been released. The full photographic archive has not been released. A military officer who commanded a classified government investigation maintained his silence under orders for 2 decades, broke it in recorded testimony, and was dead within 3 months. The files he described are partially confirmed in official declassified records. The evidence he collected has not been fully disclosed. The injuries documented on Colares Island residents in 1977 were real enough to require hospitalization and real enough for the Brazilian Air Force to classify everything their investigation produced. Whatever was over Colares Island in the final months of 1977, the Brazilian government investigated it, classified the investigation, and has never provided an explanation for the medical findings, the photographic record, or the footage that remains sealed. The island is still there. Holanda's interviews were recorded. The 15 hours of film are still classified. Number 9. Westall High School Landing Zone, Melbourne. The year is 1966. You're a student at Westall High School in the southern suburb of Clayton South, Melbourne, and it is approximately 11 in the morning on April 6th when the classroom windows fill with something moving above the school oval. Classes empty without instruction. Students run outside. What over 200 students and teachers see in the next several minutes, many of them within a few hundred feet of it, is a disc-shaped craft, silver gray, descending into the open paddock beyond the school grounds. Several students run toward it. The craft rests in the grass for a period witnesses variously estimate at 30 seconds to a few minutes. Students who reach the paddock describe a flattened circular depression where it sat, the vegetation pressed down in a ring pattern. Then it rises without sound and accelerates away to the northwest at a speed that witnesses unanimously describe as inconsistent with any conventional aircraft. Multiple witnesses reported seeing at least one other craft in the sky above the primary object during the event. The school's physical education teacher, who observed the descent from the oval, gave a detailed account of the object's approach angle and departure trajectory. The science teacher, Andrew Greenwood, who had also watched from the school grounds, described the craft's flight characteristics in technical terms he was professionally qualified to apply. Within hours, the school received visitors, not police, people in plain clothes arriving in unmarked vehicles who spoke to staff and students separately. Students were called in individually. Several reported being told to stop talking about what they had seen. Some were asked to sign papers. The headmaster addressed the school and described what they had seen as a weather balloon. The description did not match what any of them had witnessed, and they were old enough to know the difference. Here's where it gets strange. Greenwood, the science teacher, was visited separately from the general student and staff conversations. He was told, according to his later accounts, that continuing to discuss what he had seen would carry professional consequences. He was specific about this in interviews he gave decades later. He had watched the object from a position and distance that gave him a clear view of its profile, its descent, and its departure. He had described it with the vocabulary of someone trained to observe and document. The response to that documentation was a conversation about what it would cost him professionally to keep having it. Australian government files relating to the Westall event were not accessible for decades. Documents released in later years confirmed that correspondence had occurred between government departments regarding the incident, and that the event had been investigated at levels above the local response. The physical trace in the paddock was reportedly examined, and then the area was covered before the school day ended. No official explanation has ever been issued that accounts for the circular flattened trace, the consistency of the witness accounts across more than 200 independent observers, or the speed of the non-police government response to a suburban school in the middle of a Wednesday morning. Greenwood continued teaching. He never recanted his account. He continued to describe what he had seen, in the same terms, for the rest of his life, carefully, and to people he judged worth telling. He understood the professional calculation he was navigating. He had been shown that calculation clearly, within hours of the event, by people whose job was apparently to make sure he understood it. The paddock is a park now. The circle in the grass closed over long ago. The files that were released confirm a government response. They do not constitute an explanation for what 200 people saw land and leave. Number 10. Calvine crash site. The year is 1990. You're hiking near Calvine in Perthshire, in the central Scottish Highlands, when something crosses the valley sky above you that stops you completely. A large diamond-shaped craft, solid, structured, enormous, is moving slowly enough that you can hold it in your field of view. An RAF Harrier jet is visible nearby, at an altitude that makes the scale relationship between the two objects clear. The craft dwarfs the jet. You have a camera. You take 6 photographs before the object accelerates and is gone. The photographs clearly show both objects. They clearly show the size differential. They clearly show a craft whose design matches nothing in any publicly known inventory. You take your photographs and negatives to the Daily Record newspaper in Glasgow. The newspaper contacts the Ministry of Defense. The MOD sends a representative to collect everything. You hand over the photographs and the negatives. You are not publicly named. You never see the images again. The MOD classifies them for 50 years. This is documented. Wing Commander Alan Turner, the MOD officer assigned to the Calvine investigation, confirmed these facts when the files were released ahead of schedule in 2022. Following a campaign by researcher David Clark, Turner received the photographs through official channels. He described the craft in them as unlike anything in the British, American, or any other known foreign military inventory. He described the images as the clearest and most unambiguous photographic evidence of an unidentified aerial object he had reviewed in his career. His recommendation within the classified file was that the photographs be taken seriously at the highest levels of defense intelligence. They were classified. The photographer was not identified. No public statement was issued. Here's where it gets strange. Nick Pope, who worked within the MOD's Secretariat Air Staff and reviewed the Calvine photographs during his tenure there, later described them publicly as the most compelling physical evidence of an unidentified aerial object he encountered in his years of official work. The photographs showed a craft design that the Defense Intelligence Staff analyzed and could not account for. Their classification period was set at 50 years, not 25 years, the standard period for sensitive but ultimately explicable military material. 50 years, a timeline the British government determined in 1990, was the minimum before those images could safely enter the public record. Standard classification timelines for sensitive military aircraft are based on technology cycles, the period during which the design, capability, or operational deployment of the aircraft would be compromised by disclosure. Those timelines are calibrated to the known life cycle of whatever is being protected. 50-year classification is not applied to known aircraft, even classified ones. It is applied when the subject matter cannot be accounted for within any framework that exists at the time of classification. The Calvine photographs were classified for the same duration applied to material that has no framework. The photographs released in 2022 show what the witnesses described and what Turner described. The craft in them remains unidentified. The MOD has issued no explanation for what is in the images. The photographer has never been identified. Turner and Pope have both spoken publicly about what they found, carefully, within the limits available to former government officials. What neither of them has said, what neither of them could say, is that they know what it was. 10 sites, 9 countries, more than a century. Roswell's missing mortuary records, Kecksburg's lost NASA documentation, Dolnogorsk's classified isotopic analysis, Shag Harbor's sealed diver report, Varginha's transferred physician, Rendlesham's destroyed correspondence, Trans-en-Provence's unexplained soil analysis, Colares Island's sealed film archive, Westall's disappeared physical trace, and photographs in the Scottish Highlands that the British government classified for 50 years because 50 years was the shortest period they could justify. The pattern is not that these 10 sites tell the same story. The pattern is that each one, through entirely different mechanisms, under different governments, in different eras, arrived at the same outcome. The documentation doesn't exist, the scientists didn't continue, and the door didn't open. Subscribe if you want to keep following the evidence. Leave a comment below with which of these sites you would investigate first, and tell us where in the world you're watching from.